Hello again, this is Mr. Roseman, and this is part two of post-classical Japan from Sinification to Feudalism. And as I had just finished saying, the imperial capital is essentially a bubble in relation to the rest of Japan that is facing a very clear feudal system. So, as attempts at centralizing power failed, we have the rise of aristocratic families, not just in the capital, but lots of them, hundreds of them throughout Japan, where they're each going to make attempts at increasing their power. So, in the imperial capital, recall that the emperor has no authority. Those Taika reforms had failed, cenifying Japan's imperial family or the emperor's position has failed, no centralized power. Instead, he's a puppet to families like the Fujiwara who make decisions on the emperor's behalf. The emperor is carrying out his Shinto rituals and worshipped as divine, and the people throughout Japan respect the emperor, but again, the emperor has no political authority, cannot make decrees throughout Japan and then actually be carried out since there's no bureaucracy. So, because of that, this is the opening that aristocratic families have in the countryside to rise up in their own personal power. So, local powers, they're dominant in rural provinces. So, every province is controlled by a different warlord, essentially, or what was known as the daimyo, formerly called the bushi, or warriors. But these aristocratic families, since there's no bureaucracy to enforce an emperor's decision, they can do whatever they want essentially, and they largely do. They give lip service to the emperor, saying that they support him, but more so, they are focused on fighting rival daimyo or rival warlords, as we'll come to refer to those warlords as daimyo in just a few moments. So we see hundreds of small kingdoms forming throughout Japan, and every kingdom has its own feudal structure. So, as I had mentioned already, these different warlords, formerly known by Bushi, now known as daimyo, these are warlords. They built up their own fortresses for protection, very much like vassal lords in Western Europe established castles. Japan will have their own castles that look a little bit different, but basically serve the same purpose. And protecting these local warlords, these local daimyo, are their own samurai warrior forces. So, a samurai literally means, from the Japanese, one who serves, and in this case, serves their daimyo. So they were supposed to be loyal unto death, and we'll see that that's absolutely true in more ways than one for these samurai. But these samurai also promised to, through their code of honor, protect not just the daimyo, but also the emperor in the capital. So you might have this idea of samurai just rushing out onto a battlefield, hacking at one another with their swords. But originally, samurai were horseback warriors. They were cavalry warriors, where when rival samurai armies, led by their own daimyo or warlords, met on the battlefield, the best samurai from each side was chosen to represent the rival or to represent their force. And they would have a duel on the battlefield while the rest of the samurai forces watched. And whatever the result of that single battle was the result of was the result of that war. However, over time, the samurai increasingly became like the knights of Western Europe, where it was each man for himself, but guided by a very strict code of honor. So here's a couple pictures of samurai and samurai armor. Very same idea as Western European knights armor, but much more lightweight and flexible. There was a lot more maneuverability that samurai had. You can see here they kind of look like a hockey goalie with all this padding, which is actually a lot of it is sheets of metal, but rather lightweight and reinforced by silk bindings. They also wear these really intimidating helmets, um, and you can see that they are decorated really elaborately. They're really ornate. Every samurai warrior had a different symbol or style to represent their family. So there's a great sense of family honor here, very much like we see in China. And again, Confucianism is going to help to reinforce that sense of honor, um, since that was an aspect of Sinification into Japan. Here's another view, perhaps a better take on the hockey goalie kind of style of uniform. So lots of padding, but you've got to be really serious to actually go into battle wearing sandals. And that's what these samurai did. You can see this guy down here wearing sandals. Maybe a little hard to see there. But nonetheless, you also have to be pretty serious as a warrior and very confident to dress as a cat going into battle. So again, different families had different symbolic representations for their family. In this case, this is a samurai that has cat ears. I've seen others where they're wearing rabbit ears. So very different from Western European knights, and they're more so straightforward armor. Something that we also see similar to Western European knights in the feudal structure is a code of honor. And remember that post-classical Western European knights, their code of honor was known as chivalry. Well, here in Japan, for the samurai, that code of honor is called bushido. So bushi means from Japanese warrior, and do is the way of. So it's the way of the warrior. And this is a code of honor that emphasizes fidelity, so faithfulness to your family, to your daimyo, to the shogun, and also the emperor. Also, a sense of politeness. We talked about chivalry and how that encouraged the gentlemanly fight, but also a strong sense of manliness or virility. Unlike knights of Western Europe, however, we see that the samurai are rather well educated, and that comes through in the knowledge that most of these samurai, if not all of them, were strong Buddhists, in particular Zen Buddhists. Zen Buddhists, we learned from studying China and Buddhism that Zen Buddhists emphasize meditation and writing, particularly poetry. So samurai have an artistic side to themselves, not just one of military, but also of being highly cultured. Nonetheless, samurai were serious about their maintaining honor, their fidelity to their family, daimyo, shogun, and emperor. And one way we see this in particular is the widespread practice of what's known as seppuku or harikiri also. So this is ritual suicide. So it was expected that you were going to serve your master unto death. And if you were captured on the battlefield by the rival daimyo and their samurai, or perhaps your daimyo was killed, you, as a faithful samurai, were expected to commit suicide, this seppuku. And how this was performed, and trying not to be too overly gruesome, you can see this man on the left. He's taking his small dagger that he would always have on him for an occasion such as this. He would write a death poem, and then he would open up his shirt and take the dagger and essentially split his belly open. This was a sign of ultimate commitment to Bushido. This also um, helped preserve your family's honor in the face of defeat, but also your daimyo's honor, the shogun's honor, and the emperor's honor. So keep this in mind as we go forward in history, this idea of how far the extremes the Japanese warriors are willing to go to prove their faithfulness as warriors within Japan and for Japan. There were also, let me add, that there were far more Japanese samurai females than there were Western European knight females. Um, and the expectation for women was the same as men in terms of seppuku, this ritual suicide. For them, it was called jigai. And another thing to add here, um, if you were captured on the battlefield, you were given an option and the opportunity to commit seppuku. And as long as you took the first actions and actually plunged the dagger into your stomach, a person called the kaishaku, or the second, you can see this happening here in this reenactment scene. The man here is holding a sword. As soon as the samurai who is committing seppuku plunges the sword first into his belly, the other samurai from the winning side would behead the samurai to put him out of his misery, and also therefore accepting the surrender and the seppuku of the defeated. So there we go. So something considered to might be wondering as to why this might be okay or seen as spiritually okay. And you've got to consider that not only are the Japanese Shinto, but they're also widespread Buddhist. And we know that the Buddhist view on the afterlife is reincarnation. So this would be seen again not only as an honorable thing according to Bushido, the code of the honor for samurai, but also an acceptable thing and an all right thing, considering that you would be reborn. Another side note here, just for kicks: samurai who were defeated and refused to commit seppuku, or generally did not want to obey the code of honor of Bushido in such a way as more conservative samurai, there was employment opportunities for those warriors, and they were oftentimes the ones who became ninja. So ninja is a real thing. These are warriors who could get a job done militarily by any means necessary, not necessarily in a gentlemanly way. So ninja might be hired by daimyo, and because they weren't samurai, essentially, they did not have to follow that code of Bushido. The Japanese word for ninja is actually shinobi. So that actually developed in the 600s through the 900s. And I hate to do this to you, but ninja didn't really wear black. They instead wore navy blue. They also didn't have throwing stars. More often than not, they were equipped with garden tools like sickles and saws and pruning shears, things that they could drop rather quickly if they were trying to infiltrate a fortress without it being realized that a ninja or shinobi was there. So ninja essentially served as spies and assassins and underhanded warriors that didn't have to abide by Bushido. So there we go. So here is an example of a Japanese fortress. This is Osaka Castle. This was developed in the early modern era, but you can still see that there was a need for and desire for fortifications, considering the feudal system here in Japan. So making some comparisons there to fortified structures in both Western feudal Europe and feudal Japan, both in the post-classical era. All right, so here we go with the feudal system, getting into the more nitty gritty of it. So, families are going to compete for imperial control of the imperial family. And by the 1100s, the Fujiwara was no longer the dominant family in the imperial capital. Instead, it was a new family called the Minamoto. And they established a brand new government that's essentially a feudal system, but known as a shogunate. So this is a government, the shogunate is a government operated by and controlled by a shogun. So the very first shogunate was the Kamakura shogunate, and it's named for the city in which the Minamoto family came from. So a little bit about the shogunate. So you need to know this term, the Kamakura shogunate. You may also see it referred to as the Bakufu, um, this military government that describes the feudal system in Japan from the 1100s until the 1800s. We will have shogunates for Japan. So, again, shogunate and bakufu, they are interchangeable terms for us, essentially. So, this is a military government. And recall that, again, the emperor has no power, no true political power. But because of this Minamoto family, they will establish the shogunate government, where a shogun is essentially the military dictator. He will be backed by allied daimyo who are loyal to that shogun, to the Minamoto family. And we know that the daimyo are backed up by their samurai forces. So the Minamoto family, under this Kamakura shogunate or Kamakura bukufu, they rule in place of the emperor. The emperor is preserved. He's still doing his flower arranging and writing his poetry and carrying out his godly duties as head Shinto priest. Okay, so we have the very first shogunate is the Kamakura. It ends in the 1330s. It's replaced by the Ashikaga shogunate or the Ashikaga Bakufu. And by this time, again, we have these hundreds of warring states ruled by hundreds of different daimyo, each with their own samurai forces. So the only thing that's really holding Japan together, despite the fact that you've got a shogun who's a military dictator, he is only as powerful as his loyal daimyo and their loyal samurai forces. So the feudal system creates a sense of social stability and political stability, just as it did in Western Europe during the post-classical era. So let's take a look at this feudal system and how it is laid out. Here we go. So at the very top of feudal Japan, we have the shogun. Below the shogun, you have hundreds of daimyo. These are the local warlords out in the countryside. So these are examples of vassal lords. Below the daimyo, you have the samurai. They are also vassals, but to the daimyo. And then, very similar to Western Europe, you have an agricultural labor force, the peasants. Now, where does the emperor fit into this? Technically, he's above the shogun, but the emperor, he has no real power. He's revered as a god. He's more priestly than political. But like a king in Western Europe, and remember there's lots of kings and lots of kingdoms in Western Europe in the post-classical era, the emperor technically owns all of the land of Japan. The shogun, he rules in the name of the emperor. But as a result of the shogun dominating the imperial family, he basically has the power to divvy up the land in Japan. He needs support. So similar to what we saw in post-classical Western Europe, we have a feudal system that's based on reciprocity. Reciprocity, the mutual exchange of something to help one another out. And in this case, the shogun controls that land of the emperor. He will divide up land of Japan into shogun for each of his loyal daimyo. And in exchange, Those daimyo, they promise loyalty and military allegiance. If the shogun needs it, they will bring their samurai forces to his aid, and therefore, also by extension, the emperor's aid. The daimyo, they have that shogun or land grants from the shogun, and the daimyo need support to be powerful themselves in the local area as warlords. So they take some of that land and they divvy it up too into smaller shogun. Samurai families get a share of that land, therefore they're vassals. Those samurai can also pass on that land, therefore they're vassals. The samurai in exchange for land from the daimyo will give loyalty and military service. Now, last, it's predictable because we know that land trickles down the feudal system and services and loyalty trickle up. From the samurai, peasants will receive plots of land to work. And under their feudal obligations, the peasants will provide services, maybe work on the land for the samurai and daimyo, help build roads, build fortifications, but most importantly, they provide a share of the food and taxes that are demanded, and that trickles up all the way to the shogun, operating on behalf of the emperor. So with that, we have a complete feudal system, very similar to what we see in Western Europe.